Hey, shalom everyone, Yoel for Hebrew in Israel, and welcome to my comfy armchair area. And I'm going to be your um, armchair historian for today. Interesting topic that came to mind. I've been looking at this subject for, I'm going to say the better part of about 3, 4 years now, which is the rise of monotheism and political monotheism. Um, Most people use the term monotheism today in the sense of describing three religions, specifically three religions in the world, two very large ones and one very small one. Judaism being the smallest one, Christianity, and then Islam. The interesting thing about monotheism is really a political movement more than anything else. And this might surprise people because, in truth, monotheism is mostly an argument that people have and less about what people really believe. Because both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have never been fully monotheistic. Now, there is extreme monotheism, which is a result of the rise of Islam and the Kalam interpretation of what religion is, which is all based on Greek philosophy. And we're going to create a timeline here and explain the whole idea. And then we have monotheism, which is basically belief in one God. But there's also monolatrism, which is a belief that there's one major God and then other things around. It has to be said that Christianity, for example, is more monolateral than actually monotheism. Judaism is monotheism, but then there's like different variations within Judaism. And then Islam is the extreme expression of monotheism. Now, historically speaking, religions, and the term religion is a term that was coined by the Romans to indicate a practice of faith of some sort and its cultic practices and its rules as being a legitimate religion versus superstition, which is something that was rejected by Roman thinkers, claiming this is something which is not a true religion and so on. But most of these discussions were based on the political side of religion and the Roman imperial cult that required people to be loyal to the emperor and to the imperium. Now, when we look at religions in antiquity, religions were ethnocentric, which means that you had a ethnic group that had a god, usually a major god, and then many smaller gods, or lesser gods, and so on. And sometimes there's a question of inheritance between the different gods, and eventually a specific god becomes the major god. Like, for example, in the Phoenician Canaanite religion, I'm going to use that term for this discussion. Baal becomes the inheritor of El, and he becomes the major god, even though he has very powerful enemies, which means that this is a clearly pantheonic based religion where you have a major god, which is the center of your faith or center of your religion, but there are other elements that threaten you. Now, there's a very clear connection between earthly things and the way people interpreted their gods. Israelites, who were neighbors of the Phoenicians and the Canaanites, had a slightly different take on these things. Again, I'm talking here as an academic, not as a person of faith for right now. And the Israelites basically said, we have one God. And even though ancient Israelites recognized the idea that there are other gods out there, for them, there was just one God that you serve, even though the Israelites were never really good about this, because we find clear signs of worship or syncretism where you mix in other beliefs or other faiths. And we find Israelites worshiping the Queen of Heaven and referred to as Astarta as well, but also Ashtoret is another way of calling it, trying to give God a wife like the Asherah, and so on. Israelites were part of the world around them, which means that they were not monotheistic, not even remotely monotheistic. And monotheism starts becoming more of a thing when we get to the Persian era, because the Judeans, what was left of the Judean kingdom, what was left of the northern kingdom, of the kingdom of Samaria, these were people that had to deal with larger pictures. They were no longer dealing with their local ethnic neighbors who were very close to them. I think even the genetic studies now show that the Lebanese are descendants of Phoenicians, and Jews are closely related genetically to the Phoenicians. Even Ashkenazi Jews, even though people are like arguing the Ashkenazim are some kind of Europeans or Khazaris and so on. This is all false information. There's nothing you can do about it. Conspiracy, and this also connects to extreme monotheism and political monotheism, and you'll understand why. What happens is the us versus them, which is a very important theme in this discussion, expands beyond the realm of the ethnicities that were close to one another, with the occasional Egyptians and Hittites that show up who are clearly of a slightly different ethnic persuasion, even though I say persuasion because the Egyptians saw themselves as their own group, but Egyptians really were an interesting mixed bag of white people and black people and Semites and so on, speaking a Semitic language, and pretty much seeing themselves as kind of separate from the rest of the world. This is why, for example, they didn't have much of a flood story, even though their creation stories are connected to ancient waters and so on, very similar to pretty much everyone else. But the Egyptians loved presenting themselves as different. The Edomites spoke a language not too remotely different than what Canaanites spoke. Moabites clearly spoke a very similar language to Hebrew. We have a Moabite inscription, which needs to be discussed in another video. And the Ammonites, who spoke something more similar to Aramaic, and they had the Aramaic neighbors and so on. But a lot of the things were very, very similar culturally, language, clothing, food probably, and so on. But the moment you have to start dealing with the Assyrians, you start dealing with far away neighbors, like, for example, Jeremiah says, I think it's chapter 3 or 4, where he says, I'm going to bring a nation from far away that you don't know their language. People he did not speak Babylonian, did not speak Assyrian, let's put it under the larger umbrella, Akkadian. And what this meant was they had to start dealing with a much larger world, which meant that the prophets had to talk about God being everywhere, at least in the smaller world that they had, because they were dealing not only with that, they were dealing with Greeks, with people from Crete showing up here. I mean, they were dealing with them even during the First Temple era. We find references to Greek soldiers, Greek mercenaries that worked in Judea. This requires a readjustment of theology, which means the prophets have to start talking about a much more universal God. We do find hints of the universal principle in, for example, the words of Rachav to the spies. I think it's Joshua 3, and she says, "Enod milvado," there's no one else beside him. But is this really a clear monotheistic statement? Is she really saying there are no other gods? Or he is the Elohim, which maybe indicates the idea that the word Elohim means the one with power. There is no one else with the amount of power that he has, but it doesn't mean that other gods don't exist. Shlomo says in his prayer in Kings 8, something very close to monotheism. He is the greatest, he's the only one, and so on. But it's understood that this chapter may have actually had some editing done in it when we talk about the monotheistic message. Monotheism becomes a much more central thing further down the line, but we do find hints of our God is better than your God and the things like that, because what's going on is that the people speaking in the name of Israel and in the name of God are trying to explain, how do we deal with the political changes in the world that we live in now that we're dealing with larger empires who clearly are stronger than us? What is the place of our God within this picture? And as part of the hope message, the idea is presented that our God eventually will rule over everyone. But this is still not monotheism. The answer that we get is sometimes that other gods are there, but they're less powerful. Eventually, gods need to be reduced to either angels. This is one of the ways this is answered, by presenting them as a form of angels. We see this in Daniel. The angel that represents Israel has to fight the angel that represents Persia, or something like that. And also, gods are reduced to the level of demons. This is especially true when it comes to Christianity, because Christianity, for example, comes in contact with pagans and basically says, oh, your gods are demons and nothing else. We don't really see true monotheism until it becomes a strife between two religions, Judaism on the one hand and Christianity on the other. even then, we don't really see true monotheism until we get to Maimonides. And Maimonides, we have to put a pin in him for a second, and we'll get there later on. What happens is Judaism and Christianity kind of have a brawl over supremacy for a short while until Christianity basically becomes a Roman religion. And that's where the politics come in. When Christianity spreads within the Roman Empire, it loses its ethnic background, it becomes Romanized, and Christianity no longer, even if it, in its early stages, no longer really represents the original religion it comes from. When you look at the New Testament, the man there who preaches, Yeshua or Jesus, is a man who mostly speaks to his own people. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning Paula Fredrickson with her work on early Christianity, and Serge Rangel, who has a wonderful book in Hebrew, which is here somewhere on my shelf, about early Christianity, and obviously David Flusser, who wrote the book Jesus and Other, and the Jewish origins of Christianity, where it's very clear that he is not talking about another religion. I think anyone with half a mind will understand that this is not what he's talking about. And he is talking to his own people. The lost sheep of Israel are not some ethereal people that are supposed to show up. At the time before Paul, we don't even have this concept. He's only talking to his own people. And he's only talking within the confines of the Galilee and Judea. He is executed for, depending what it is, political strife with the Romans or with the Sadducees. I think that the Romans weren't really interested in him because he wasn't a true threat to them, because they had these types of messiahs show up every once in a while and the Romans saw it fizzle away. The issue here was that he was a bit more aggressive when he came to Jerusalem. Whether he turned tables or not is an interesting debate that you can see differences within the canonical Gospels about, does he just talk to them or does he turn tables? And there's like a progression there in the interpretation of the events. But what's more important to us is that there's someone within Jerusalem who doesn't like him. That's political religion, because the Sadducees, not the Pharisees and not the scribes, they're inserted forcefully into the text. As a textualist, I can see it. It almost popped down in front of my eyes. One of the first things that I noticed was that their insertion there is nonsensical to the text. But the thing is that he deals with a political movement within Jerusalem that's been in control of the temple for a very, very long time, and therefore he is technically a threat because he is a populist. People like him. People truly do like him. I mean, it seems to be very clear like that, because he speaks in a way that is kind to everyone. And the sections where he actually gives a speech, we call them speeches within the textualist understanding of things. He is very pro-Torah. He is a Jew living within his period of time and so on, but he's not giving a fixed theology yet. He's not talking about a specific theology, because at the time there were many ways of approaching things. People were not monotheistic yet, and there was not one theology. There were different interpretations of how they understood what keeping Torah meant and what being loyal to the God of Israel meant. It was still a very ethnic-based religion, even though that we see the interactions between Jews and non-Jews at the time, and there were plenty of non-Jews who were interested. But at the same time, there's a brewing philosophy in the West where a God is not there's only one God, and this is a God of philosophy. He's not really interested in human beings. There's no real commandments, and therefore just be an ethical person. And there's different offshoots of this specific philosophy. I'm not giving a specific name, even though it's mostly related to the Stoics. And the Stoics were also very against blood ceremonies in temples. This is why they sometimes saw what Judaism does as barbaric. And this philosophy is inserted into Christianity eventually. But what happens is Paul moves I don't have to teach this history to my viewers, but Paul basically moves this concept into Asia Minor, and from there it spreads through the slaves who see a certain hope for themselves within this new religion, and it spreads throughout the houses, through the servants, into the women who are in charge of the houses, and then into their husbands. It leaks into the army, and the army starts seeing a rise in Christianity. At this point, Christianity is still not monotheistic, and people who believed in the Christ are still people who are Roman. What happens is it becomes part of the Roman structure of society, and now it becomes political. And the Roman soldiers, who have a fierce and bitter battle with Jews for around the year 66, well into the second half of the second century, eventually get very angry towards Jews. At this point, some of the highest clerks, or some of the clerks of Christianity, are people who come from the Roman soldier background, generals and so on. Actually, most of the structure of Christianity this very day is based on the way the Roman Empire was built, and the way the territories were divided, and provinces and so on, and the cities, which become the major cities for Christianity, are run by people who are basically Roman soldiers. The emperor becomes the pope, and things like that. And then, because Christianity has a problem, or Rome has a problem with Judaism, we start seeing very anti-Jewish rhetoric, but it's mostly because there's a desire to create a new Roman identity under this religion, and therefore has nothing to do with who Yeshua was, or who Paul was, or what the original faith was. Now it's a Roman thing. Now it's a Roman practice. It's a Roman political movement which controls everything. Now, of course, Christianity within itself had lots of arguments about, one type of Christ versus another, and so on. This is not going to be a talk about the different types of Christianity, but eventually we also have the split where you have the Roman Empire versus the Eastern Empire, where the Eastern Empire is less influenced by the Catholicism of Rome, and therefore the people there try to imitate more Jewish life. And eventually the interesting variation of this is what happens in Ethiopia, where the Ethiopian church, which is a Monophysite church, which means they believe in one Jesus, one Father, one Yeshua. It's one thing. The minutiae are kind of interesting, and I found to be very complicated to understand, because it's really splitting hairs. But essentially what happens is they are less anti-Jewish, and they become anti-Jewish only when the Portuguese arrive in Ethiopia, but they keep Shabbat for a very long time, and they keep what we call kosher, and feasts and so on. And because they said, look, it's very clear when you read the New Testament that this man was Jewish, and therefore we go back to the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and decide to do what's presented there. At this stage, both Judaism and Christianity are claiming one God, even though there's lots of pagans and so on, pagans which are villages. That's the term what paganos actually means. But eventually what happens is Rome starts deteriorating, and there's a need to unify everyone under one flag, and that's where Constantine steps in, and they have this massive debate that goes on until you reach Nicaea and the creeds and so on. But essentially what happens is Judaism and Christianity are duking it out for a very long time over what is the belief that you have. So both Judaism and Christianity are a result of political strife between two religions who are basically hating one another. And Jews have a good reason to hate Christianity because it's Rome, and Rome is harmful towards who they are. Now, as this goes on, Christianity tries to define itself, Judaism tries to define itself, and eventually what happens is that everyone's trying to explain who God is, and Judaism has taken a much more monotheistic approach to things, because they're seeing how this early Christianity becomes very, very, I would say, pagan to some degree. Then steps in Islam eventually, which tries to detach itself from Judaism and Christianity eventually, because Muhammad has issues with Jews and Christians politically. Jews basically tend to bugger off, and literally they just tell him to go away. And this is why he massacres people, for example, in Khaybar, and then there's a revenge against him, and he eats a poisoned leg of lamb, and he dies from it eventually after a lot of pain. And Islam needs to try to define itself in a different way, but Islam at the same time reads these philosophers who see a transcendent God who's detached from everything, and say, eventually Muhammad and his followers basically say, the students later on, say, look, God has to be detached from this world, so you can't define who God is, you can't talk about physicality and so on. This is where monotheism steps in, but it's militarized, and therefore, at this point, both Judaism and Christianity have to respond to Islam. Christianity sticks to its guns. and stays pretty much the same. Judaism responds to Islam because Jews have to now debate this new religion, and Judaism eventually, parts of Judaism adopt the same philosophical approach of Islam, which says, oh, full monotheism, extreme monotheism, and Maimonides invents a new form of Judaism, which is an extreme variation of this, ignoring the fact that what he's actually presenting, the same way Islam is a Greek philosophical, Greco-Roman philosophical principle that is basically not what the Bible describes. Lots of scholars have pointed out this. Mark Smith, for example, points this out, that this is not the original faith of the Bible. People believe that God did have a form, there is a sort of physicality to him, and what kind of physicality is a very good question. But today, when you talk about religion, everyone thinks it's supposed to be this abstract God, and when you start talking about heaven and hell in a completely, in a physical way, it's not what religion is. But this is not what religion was back in the day. And then monotheism is militarized and politicized. So Christianity uses it to fight Judaism. Judaism fights amongst itself. Islam uses this to fight everyone around them. And what's even more ridiculous is that Islam ignores the Bible, ignores everything that comes before it, and claims it's the original, the inheritance, the origins of everything. And this is where monotheism becomes very, very dangerous. It's politicized. It's turned into a weapon to harm one another, instead of saying, look, this is a faith. This is something that is binds us together as ethnic groups, and we define our religions through the ethnic principle. So monotheism spreading around the world, becoming, at least for Western culture, the standard for religion, it actually is the opposite of what ancient faith was like. And then it becomes very dangerous, because the moment you say, this is the only God I have, you have no tolerance for others. And this is what happens within the breakoffs within Christianity. Judaism has less of an issue, but in Islam and Christianity, because everyone's pulling to their own direction instead of saying, look, this is my interpretation of what I think faith is supposed to be like. And that's political and militarized religion. And only happens because of monotheism. There's a lot to say about this, but that is what monotheism actually gave the world. It gave this idea of exclusivity. And even though we try to paint these things in a beautiful way, this is not what it did. Monotheism, to some degree, ruined religion, ruined faith. And this is not an easy pill to swallow. It took me a very long time to even bring myself to make this video. And as my son is making himself breakfast, it makes me think about the fact that many things in our world are based on us getting used to something. And when I tell, for example, my son, look, if you want to eat breakfast, you have to do it in a certain way, I suddenly realize, wait, this is the standard of breakfast for the Western world. When you go to other countries, you see other things. So are we thinking within a very, very particular box? Are we actually self-aware within our own faith? Or are we just mimicking things that we inherit without actually thinking, wait, is this really the thing that's to be done? So my son, for example, is making for himself eggs for breakfast. Actually, protein for breakfast is very, very good. But the thing is that he's going for a certain standard. The standard is fine, it unifies and so on. But then if you go online, you see how people argue, oh, you should eat this for breakfast, that for breakfast. Who says you have to actually eat breakfast? Just as a thought. Who says maybe you should eat only lunch and dinner and skip breakfast, as some people are arguing today? The point is to think, to know what the true knowledge should be and what really was done, and not whatever we're projecting into what we think should be done today. And yes, you should eat your breakfast. Anyhow, things to think about. There's a lot to say about this, and I might continue this discussion through actual verses and so on, and show the progression. But for now, think about it. Monotheism is not the beliefs of the Bible, even though we see echoes of it because people edited later on. But the main thing is that monotheism kind of ruined religion. It really did. And without offending anyone, which I know many people will be offended by this, but is it possible that by reversing monotheism and returning to what the Tanakh originally says, not Greek philosophy as people pretend to thinking that's what Judaism really is about, would it fix things? I have doubts because there's a lot of ego. A lot of religious interpretation is about ego. So think about it. Kol tov.